I'm one of your hosts, and your other host is.
Happy Molly. Hi, welcome to Koviki Talk.
Koviki Talks is a 21 episode series where we try to find the information. We're looking for wisdom. So it's all things Pacific Islander that's COVID-19 related. Last week, we talked to a couple doctors about just research overall, and we're going to progress as we go through the series. We're going to progress through clinical trials and a cure and all those kind of things. But I think the foundation needs to be set. And that's what we are going to do here today. I'm going to introduce one of your hosts, Esther Kia'aina from the Pacific Basin Development Council. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us this evening, we have Corina Penaia with the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander COVID-19 Data Policy Lab intern. Welcome to Koviki Talk. Thank you for joining us.
So today we're going to talk about why the census is important. And I know everybody's heard a lot of this, but to hear it in this relation and hear it from these people's standpoint, our guest standpoint, and we're about wisdom. So you're going to get wisdom from them after we get a little information from them. So today's check-in question is going to be, what did you want to be when you were growing up? So an 8 or 10-year-old Naki wanted to be a what, Naki?
Naki wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a teacher. I had one of my most favorite teachers when I was in the 5th grade, Mrs. Olson. And she taught English, and she was so attentive and super nice and so beautiful. I thought all teachers were so beautiful. And I was thinking, I'm going to be just like them. And that's not the road I chose, but I've always admired teachers. And so I wanted to be a teacher when I was growing up. How about you, Corina?
We're not teaching today, Naki, but we have people on that are going to teach for us.
Right.
Yeah, when I was younger, I really wanted to be an astronaut. I enjoyed all the science subjects and doing a little bit of math here and there, but of course that changed. And I'm currently pursuing the public health field, so I'm grateful for that.
Awesome.
Thank you, Corina. I just saw that there's there's a group going up right now that's all women. The whole group is women, so that's something that maybe would have been in your path. Esther.
Thanks, Carl. You know, I don't know specifically what profession I would have been interested in, but I know in many of our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, especially the girls, a lot of us who are raised with larger brothers, we always have to scrap with them, right? And so all I know is that whatever I wanted to do in life, I wanted to be a warrioress. And I wanted to be able to, you know, be on par with anyone and to fight. And, you know, I've utilized that value set actually throughout my life. So I've been very fortunate because I didn't really know about the different professions. So I wouldn't have had the wherewithal to figure it out. I just figured I'd get my warriors-like values and apply it to anything in life.
Awesome. You're fighting for us. I'm going to find out more information about that here in a couple of minutes. I wanted to be a heavy equipment operator. I either wanted to operate like a backhoe or a tractor or something along those lines. Police officer maybe, but mainly I thought it was really cool when I saw big machines, big trucks, tractors, and that kind of thing. So somehow all of our paths didn't end up the way that they are, but they do bring us here today. So I'm just going to get straight into your area of expertise. If you can tell us a little about the history of the census, especially within the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, and the creation of that term, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. We hear that all the time, NHPI. So give us a little bit of the history of that and how that term came about.
Thank you, Carl. Again, my name is Esther Kia'aina. I'm live streaming from Kailua, Oahu, and it's a pleasure to be here to be talking about issues very dear to our community. There's probably no better time than what we're dealing with on COVID-19 on the importance of data. And I think it's critically important not only for the census, but for the larger pictures. So just to give you some background historically, the critical year for us was 1997. And in 1997, the White House Office of Management and Budget, after a long battle by Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities nationally, broke apart Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander from the Asian or Pacific Islander category for OMB Directive number 15, which is the federal guideline governing racial and data collection. Now, the reason that's important is that while I am not currently pleased with the 2020 census form because it still locks us all in with the other groups, when the census is done, when it rolls up, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are now broken off. So in short, in 1997, we had an opportunity in 2000 for the first time in history to be able to have our numbers pulled out of the Asian or Pacific Islander category. So 2020 is important because it's the third time. Now, prior to 1997, I actually went back as far as 1960, the 1960 census. There was an effort, and I believe largely because of the Hawaii delegation, where you actually had Native Hawaiian and part Hawaiian broken off. In 1980 was the first time, 1980 census, that Samoan and Guamanians were added. Of course, Guamanians told the census, we are Chamorro, and in 1990, they actually included all of us under the Asian or Pacific Islander category, and but we had a checkoff box. So again, Native Hawaiian, Samoan, and it was Guamanian or Chamorro had their own checkoff boxes. And so it was only the 2000 census where not only do we have our own checkoff boxes, but we have a fill in the blank for all other Pacific Islanders to be able to fill in their racial identification. Moving forward, I know Corina is going to talk about the census. I would be delighted to answer any questions, but for now, I'm actually going to turn it over to Corina to talk a little bit about what she's doing at the data lab and why the census is important to our communities. Corina?
Sure, thank you. As mentioned before, my name is Corina Penaia. I currently work as a program manager for API Forward Movement, and I'm also a very humble team member of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander COVID-19 Data Policy Lab. And so since the beginning of the pandemic, this Data Policy Lab convened with other NHPI leaders and community agencies really to join forces and organize around what's been going on. As we continued to meet weekly, we learned more about the real life experiences and the challenges that folks were facing, which ultimately led to the NHPI COVID-19 Data Policy Lab, which is housed under UCLA's Center for Health Policy Research under the direction of Dr. Nienes Ponce. And so as far as we know, this is the first time a research university on the continent has really committed resources to sustaining a dedicated pipeline of Pacific Islander researchers to meet our community's needs for data. So this means things like our community gets to decide on what it needs, and people from our community are really responsible for delivering it. And we don't have to explain why we should matter. Some of the goals that we've put together for our data policy lab is to protect our families, because we know that data justifies bringing in resources, money, and also grabs attention of those in power who make these important decisions, to empower our community with knowledge. And we know that COVID-19 is hitting our communities hard, but we didn't know how hard or how it was hitting us the worst. And so when our community knows about these things, they can act accordingly. And the last thing was to democratize the data. And we don't want researchers to enter our communities, take our data, and then charge us to access the research that wouldn't have been possible without us. And so we believe that our community should be able to access our data and tell our stories for ourselves. Because personally for me, I wouldn't trust another family telling my family stories. In terms of some of the data products we've been able to create successfully, over the past few months, our team has been working nonstop to collect and generate data reports that focus on how our community is being affected by this and where we're seeing some of those outbreaks. And we've created national data summaries, state summaries, and an NHPI dashboard that is readily available for folks to use online. Some of these successes include one of our team members, Carla Thomas. She was able to utilize some of that data, which was generated from the census population estimates, to successfully apply for funding to create a COVID-19 testing site and also distribute PPE to her church members. And so this is what we're really hoping to support with, so that our folks feel more comfortable when they're seeking answers, or they just simply want to receive some of those resources that they deserve. And we know that the data can't replace the stories of those that we've lost to COVID-19. Our community is much more than just the numbers themselves, but the numbers are part of our story. And ultimately, filling out the census helps us do that.
What are some of the other ways that census data impacts COVID-19 that people might not realize?
Sure. And so we knew that COVID-19 was hitting our Pacific Islander communities pretty badly, but we just didn't know how or where. And so when we were able to pull some of those numbers and utilize the census population estimates, we were really surprised that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders had the highest proportion of COVID-19 cases when compared to all other races and ethnicities, especially in 13 states. We weren't just number one, we stood head and shoulders above other communities' case rates in many of states where a lot of our members live. So thinking about states like California, Utah, Washington, and Arkansas, this is most definitely not a race we want to be winning right now. And we were only able to stumble upon these findings because of the census data that allowed us to run those calculations.
Naki, I'd like to add to that. You know, the OMB directive number 15 doesn't just impact census, of course. It impacts all data collected by the states and counties. So with regard to the COVID-19 data in Hawaii, of course, census data might be helpful with regard to our proportionate funding that we got from the Federal CARES Act, but it was actually the data collected by the Department of Health that we had to fight them over. And we said, you only have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander data collected. And they said, well, that's the federal guideline. And I actually wrote a very aggressive and angry post to Dr. Anderson, who's the Department of Health Director in Hawaii. And I said, you can do better, because Hawaii has the largest Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population in the country. You have the discretion to break it off, right? And let me tell you why it's important, because now they have broken it off, and they have found that the non-Native Hawaiian community in Hawaii, while making up only 4% of the population, are 30% of the COVID-19 cases. So all of you who are listening in your communities, please do not think that just because OMB provides guidelines for minimal data collection, that your counties and states with significant Native Hawaiian PI populations cannot go the extra yard and use what is happening to our communities across the nation to your advantage, and tell them policy-wise why we deserve to be funded. If you've been following what has been going on with the Marshallese who are living in Arkansas, the death rate was so high, right? They finally have it under control. But a study done out of the East-West Center is showing that our Marshallese and Micronesian communities here in Hawaii, there is a direct connection between when they were cut off from Medicaid and other federal benefits under the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 and mortality rate. So as the health access decreased, mortality rates went up. And that is completely unacceptable. And that goes to another policy issue where we're trying to fight for Medicaid reinstatement and other federal public benefits for our Micronesian communities across the country.
Wow.
So data is important, but I just say that census is not the only agency that is impactful to our communities. All agencies, all institutions, including higher education institutions. I mentioned earlier about 1997. The genesis for why we fought to be desegregated was not because of the census. It was because Native Hawaiians at Stanford University complained to Senator Akaka, who I worked for in the early 1990s, who said, Senator, we are considered overrepresented in higher education universities because the checkoff box for college applications says Asian or Pacific Islander. Sometimes it doesn't say Pacific Islander, it says Asian. And so that was the genesis that led us to the Department of Education, who told us, not our Kuleana, go to the Office of Management and Budget. So if you look at post-1997 data, I can guarantee you that there is a significant increase of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders who have gotten into post-secondary education than pre-1997. And that is because we rightfully deserve to be considered underserved communities and disadvantaged with regard to access to higher education. So all those decades prior to, we were being hurt. So I know we need to make sure we get the 2020 census. I'm here to just bring us back to some of the big picture issues and to tell all of you out there, service providers especially, to make sure you fight for your data and not just rely on what they say, oh, we're relying on census data. It doesn't work like that. State data, county data, institutional data, right?
So I see that the Kamehameha Schools has a lot of people, a lot of graduates, a lot of alumni involved in the NHPI advocacy. Is that something that's spoken about at during schooling in Kamehameha schools, or is that something that the alumni has taken up? Just they happen to be involved like that.
I don't know if that's, I think it's recent, to be honest with you, because, and the COVID, of course, brought us all together, but that could have been an evolution, quite frankly, of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander category being created. So now we feel like we have a platform to be able to educate the American people and policymakers that the needs and concerns of the NHPI community versus the diversity of our Asian community, we need to, it needs to be heard, right? So, you know, I'm an alumni of Kamehameha, and, you know, they have a lot of resources, of course, because of Pauahi Bishop, who is the great granddaughter of King Kamehameha the Great. So they have a lot of resources to be able to have researchers. But in my view, I think our Native Hawaiian community could do a better job, quite frankly, of helping our Pacific Islander communities in Hawaii. I don't mind task force, but task force for me are a label unless you're really going to do the work and make sure that the communities are getting funding. So in the last several weeks, I've been working behind the scenes to try to direct funding to those Pacific Islander organizations who are in greatest need.
This is to of the panelists. So what do you think is the most misunderstood piece in the Pacific Islander community about the census? There's a lot of different feelings out there. You know, they don't want this many people, they don't want it to be known that there are X amount of people living in the house, or you know, I've heard a whole bunch of different things, but what do you think is the one or two of the most common misperceptions about the census in the Pacific Islander community?
I'll have Corina go first.
Sure. I definitely think that there's an issue with language barriers, right? So making sure that the census and all the materials, the promo materials and education resources that we're sending out are in language. However, that doesn't fall within one of the 12 or 13 non-NHPI languages for the census. So that definitely is one of the barriers to allowing folks to really understand how beneficial some of these funds are for. And the second thing is just getting a better idea of like the comprehensive idea of what exactly this funding is going to be used for, right? So we know that the census helps us determine how trillions of dollars are distributed to communities such as ourselves over the next 10 years. And so the census data helps us determine how federal funding is flown into the states and the communities. So thinking about services like healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid, financial aid for our student athletes and our scholars, thinking about how you are planning to fund your education so that you can focus on solely learning instead of working multiple jobs, you know, to pay off loans. Thinking about schools and the funding that those folks receive now with the pandemic and everything has been shifted to virtual learning, thinking about those laptops and the iPads that young scholars are using to connect, right? So we are unable to identify what the greatest need is and what some of those resources are without filling out this short, hopefully 10-minute questionnaire that is totally protected by the government. They're not allowed to disseminate any of your individual information to folks. And it's also not asking for immigration status, which is definitely something that puts a lot of fear into some of our folks who have definitely been here for a long time and haven't been able to access some of those resources. So really just boiling it down and making it as straight to the point as possible for folks is something that can help them hopefully take it and see the bigger picture.
Thank you, Corina.
Carl, I agree that immigration for those who are, who, a lot of our populations, Pacific Islander communities have the most diverse in the country because we have indigenous and immigrant populations that compose our community. So immigration is one. The other, quite frankly, is an unappreciation for the value of who we are as a people. And I think that challenge is for all of us collectively, because now that we know the history of the pain that went into breaking us apart, we need to tell them that we have to keep it, because otherwise the federal government one day might just see no need for it because of our numbers, right? So during the outreach efforts in the last year, so I was part of a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Census Committee. And my colleagues do know I was critical because I didn't feel enough Pacific Islanders were represented on the committee. So as part of my outreach efforts, I always went into communities. I brought together Samoan ministers, actually at Kamehameha schools, because I was looking for a free venue, of course. And then, and then I work with the Chamorro community, which is very challenging. They're one of the more westernized communities in our population. So I had to make sure that those from the CNMI and Guam were included. And I always brought up the history of OMB and how we fought for it. Now, at the time Senator Akaka fought for it, he was also talking about Native Hawaiians individually, right? And he brought up the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And under that, Article 33, of course, includes a clause that says Indigenous peoples have the right to self-identify themselves. And the reason I share that is the counter argument that we used with the federal government when they concluded that there will be no changes. And Senator implored to them that this is no longer just about you, federal government, determining how we should identify. Out of the 800 people, 7,000 were Native Hawaiians from across the country who asked for the disaggregation of the data. So we had all the evidence behind us. And so the reason I share that is that I think that as we move forward beyond 2020 and start thinking about 2030, perhaps this is a beginning of a wonderful dialogue to work collectively across the nation to help embolden our community to become more active, so that they can understand why it's important. It's important because we are the only group in the country that were given our own category. And again, it's not just about us keeping it, it's about who we are as a people. And I'm hoping that in time, the United States and the rest of the world will learn a little bit more about us.
Yeah, if I could just add to that a little bit, in terms of looking at things in the future or trying to overcome some of these challenges, I think it's really important to lean on the younger folks, the younger leaders who are preparing to take over some of this work and sustain, hopefully, a pipeline of Pacific Islander leaders who can continue this work. And I think there's a lot of power in a lot of the youth that we are mentoring and also learning from, because a lot of times we lean on the elders and the folks who have been in the game for a long time to really learn how to navigate these spaces. And so I know Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, when I joined the Pacific Islander Leadership of Tomorrow program back in the days in 6 years ago, they were working a lot on building a pipeline of young scholars to stay rooted to their culture and also learn how to utilize some tools to navigate some spaces that may not be as comfortable for them. And so it might be a powerful way to move forward in terms of looking at 2030 and what the census might look like, to start bringing in folks from the younger communities, looking at the churches that we're partnering with and building upon their youth groups to make sure that we're including all voices at the table so that we can collectively work together to count everyone.
I think that's
Yeah.
a good point made, that we're one of the youngest and fastest growing minorities in the United States. So engaging our younger generation and it's kind of cliche to say that's really our future, but when that high of a percentage of our population is under 25, that is our future. And to get them engaged early means a lot. Great point, Corina. Naki.
Yeah, that is a great point. We do need to get the younger generation involved, because 10 years from now, they're going to be trying to educate the kids, kind of the younger generation. Esther, are you finding that the state of Hawaii is having a harder time than other mainland states to get PIs to participate in the census? Or is there a difference?
I think so. I think so. So one is just outreach and failure of the mechanisms they don't have the same ground game as they do in the Hawaiian community. The institutional structures are not there. So, a lot of in fact, one of the challenges facing the community, the PI community with regard to funding, there's kind of some background drama going on right now. And one of the reasons is a lot of the organizations don't have their 501(c)(3) status. So the funding stream is going through the major organizations. And so some of the organizations that have that status and have a reputation and have the fiscal accountability mechanisms in place are likely to get funded vis-a-vis the others. So that's a longer term challenge. But I think the other problem is linguistically, right? Linguistically, the state of Hawaii can do a better job, and just going out and reaching to the community, they don't have that capacity. So one of my criticisms behind the scenes recently for the city and county of Honolulu, when they actually asked me if I could kokua and help, and I said, regrettably, I'm running a political campaign. I'm in a political campaign at the moment. I said, but let me give you my mana'o. Do not just give the funding to the larger organizations and have them outreach. You have to give the funding directly to those PI communities that have the capacity, and let them spend the money for outreach. Let them translate, right? One of the big problems, especially, and I hate to keep on bringing up the Micronesian community, but it's something I've dealt with a long time, is that separate from Medicaid, which was cut off in 1996 under the Welfare Reform Act, so was SNAP, food stamps. So all the funding that's coming from the Federal CARES Act to the state of Hawaii for food stamps, they're not eligible. Wow. So when I told them, hey, you need to give money for food, and they said, why? Get plenty food banks and all. And I said, because the current funding streams do exclude Micronesians. So very complicated. We could do better. I have to tell you, very impressed with what's going on the continent. You guys were at the forefront affecting your leadership. And I have to give credit to some of your counties that disaggregated data on their own, because you guys were hitting all of the media before Hawaii was. Hawaii was behind the 8 ball, quite frankly. And that's why I had to write my Dear Dr. Anderson post. And it took a couple of months before the data was disaggregated. So good job. I want to expand a little about what Corina said, because with regard to our up and coming leaders and Tawai, I need to applaud EPIC for having one of the first DC offices for Pacific Islanders. I had the honor of meeting Sina, right? Is it Uipi is the last name? Is that how you pronounce it? She's Tongan. And when we talk about advocacy, again, we are not just talking about 2020 census. We are talking about advocacy, UPI. Okay, UPI. Okay, I got it. I see it right there. Okay, so We are talking about advocacy, period. Fighting for our communities at all levels of government so that we could be running or working as staff for the neighborhood board, for our city councils, for our state legislature, for our congressional delegates, going up to the United Nations and learning a little bit more about how our Pacific Island independent countries are faring at the United Nations, right? So many wonderful opportunities. So Corina, I'm so proud of you. I like to consider me, I'm at the ante level in life. So hopefully in the near future, I'll just be kicking back somewhere and enjoying life and watching all of you guys do all the good work. But I think it's critically important to have young people involved.
You bring up a great point. Saying auntie to the wrong person is like saying ma'am to the wrong person. Better be appropriate when you use that. You know, you brought up a really good point about the 501c3, and I think that Corina, you can chime in on this too, being from the data policy. Your point about the 501c3 and that really being as close as you can get to the people that need the help, right? So they're really at ground level where where boots meet the ground, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. There's about $1.6 trillion that the federal government's going to allocate to 316 programs, and they're going to allocate to other community-based programs. Talk about why it's so important for organizations to get a 501c3 so that they can be a part of that process of getting help to the community.
Right. So, Auntie Esther, feel free to chime in. Definitely for the work that I'm doing, the 501c3 has been really helpful for us to access funds for things like food distributions, right? So thinking about COVID-19 impacts and how that has really challenged access to food, specifically healthy foods. And so one thing that we've been really grateful for when applying for different grants and proposals with API Forward Movement, we've been able to access some of those funds to connect with our local network of Asian American Pacific Islander farmers, and also partner with some of these NHPI church and faith-based groups to make sure that they have enough food on the table, even though sometimes our partners ask for things like cans of pisupo or the Spam and everything that tastes really delicious but is really hard on our arteries.
Right.
We want to make sure that we are putting healthy produce and eggs and things that are really nourishing our bodies, and just making sure that even though this might not be enough, it's definitely a great starting point, considering that everything happened all at once in March and we've all been adapting to the different times. But that's one example of how the 501c3 has really helped us to access some of the funds that other NHPI groups and CBOs in the area haven't been prioritizing at the moment. But I definitely think that things like increasing COVID testing sites or looking for protective equipment for folks who are still in the field working every day, multiple jobs, just to provide enough to turn the lights on. So those are some of the things that we are able to access when we do things like fill out the census, so that money trickles down into the different states. And then hopefully, if we do get counted properly, we're able to, sign up for some of those funds and make sure that we don't have to advocate as hard as we are doing now with the current pandemic, so that things will be a little bit smoother and we're able to streamline that process.
But doesn't that make it even more important for us to fill out the census so that people know we're in these communities that are needing funding? If we, like you said, we're advocating and fighting, trying to get the money for people that may not have filled out the census in 2010.
That's correct.
So it's so important.
I think
Definitely.
so. Here's a point with that is we are a 501c3 and we had applied for funding, and in the grant proposal, there's a section for demographics in there, and we even chastised them a little bit in the interview process that it's a demographic section, and I had to use my own personal knowledge about San Francisco to say where the Pacific Islanders lived, because their own demographic section didn't have demographic information for Pacific Islanders. So there's the example of there's a million, there's $1.5 trillion out there that are going to programming. And unless we can say, hey, there's 10,000 of us in this city, or there's 30,000 of us in this county, it's hard to leverage that 501c3 to say that I've got a population that I need to serve unless the numbers are there. So that was really the point. And Mac brought it back really well, is we're trying to the community, but the government needs to know that the community is there to serve. Otherwise, we're asking for all these things and they're saying, well, there's only 250 people in that city. So thank you for volunteering that, Corina. And Esther?
Carl, yeah, you raise a good point. So two thoughts. First, yes, obtaining the status is critically important. And let's not forget about our churches, because our churches are faith-based institutions, and they actually have a lot of times, if you go on grants.gov and Google it, there are actually different funding streams for faith-based organizations separately from community organizations. I would say this, you need it. If you don't have it, it doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. You go and ask a friend and ask them to be the fiscal conduit for 2 Micronesian one-stop centers that I helped establish in Guam and Hawaii while I was at the Department of the Interior. They hit their 5th year in funding from the federal government, $250,000 per annum. Only this year did the Hawaii One-Stop Center get its 501(c)(3) status. So it's actually partnering with a Hawaiian organization fiscally. So don't use that as a deterrent to fight for your people. Second, yes, data is important, but let's not rely on the census data only to fight for ourselves. In other words, as we organize as a people, what we should do is just do our own survey. So I know the Asian community is really good at that. So what you do is you just, through your coconut wireless, just trying to start surveying your community via email. Would you share, so you start learning the different, the multitude of groups within our NHPI community in the area. It doesn't hurt. A lot of times they're looking for you to create the narrative, and they want to fund you. But regrettably, the onus is on us. But I dare say that we should be able to meet the challenge, because if I only relied on data to fight for us, I don't know if I would feel as, I still feel optimistic. It's been, I fought a lot of battles, but I feel optimistic about fighting for our people, because I think we are better off than we were 30 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, who knew that COVID-19 was going to happen, right? It's the pandemic like this that makes it so important for us to fill out the census now. Yeah. What if this happens in another 10 years and the resources that are needed for your community because you did not fill out the census is not provided for you? And, people like Corina and Esther are left to fight for you because we did not fill out the census. I think it's so, so important for us to do our part. It's 9 simple questions, right? So simple, confidential, nobody's going to come knock at your house unless you don't fill it out, right? And you don't want nobody to come knock on your door. Like most of us, a lot of us are private, and so it's so important now, especially during COVID, now there's food distributions. Corina and her team are fighting to get food to distribute. A lot of churches are trying to scrape up what they can for their church members that are probably not working and have lost their jobs or just scraping to get by. So that is just an example of one of the resources that we need. There's so much more that people are not sure about or don't know. Esther, can you go more into that, or Corina, about what other resources so that we can get this through to our community, why it's so important besides, the food distribution, but there's other resources that they don't understand?
I just saw a question from Tavai with regard to the portal I was talking about. For the federal government, it's called grants.gov.
Oh, that.
And in the good old days when we didn't have the internet, I know, Corina, it's hard for you to believe that, right? In our good old days, I had this big book called the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, and I manually had to flip through it. So
Wow.
now you're able to go on there, and you can actually, first lesson is to pull up the word Pacific Islander. Now that doesn't mean that that's all that you're eligible for, right? So think about what you're interested in: economic development, housing, right? There's a portal there where you just put the label and push it in. One area that I will tell you about, because I'm just thinking in all my history of fighting for grants, the Administration for Native Americans, if some of you are not familiar with it, it is administered at the Department of Health and Human Services. And I'm going to talk about federal grants, if you don't mind, because I was in DC for 24 years. So Administration for Native Americans, and it's wonderful, by the way, social and economic development. And it is one of the only federal programs where you need not have to be a federally recognized tribe to be eligible. And so the Hawaii delegation, in concert with the Pacific delegates, fought to have Pacific Islanders eligible for that funding stream. So it's something to look at, because it includes, I know that one is language preservation. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that in your communities, especially the West Coast, you're so progressive. At the county and state levels, you must have a lot of funding opportunities. The Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG, is funneled down many times through the county. And that provides a lot of social and economic development for a lot of communities. So
That is thinking that is there a different path for indigenous tribes in the mainland? Is there a different path for, actually, I'm going to go ahead and ask that because I'm not sure I understand it. Are Hawaiians recognized the same as like the Sioux or the Iroquois?
no.
Or
No, that is a topic for another discussion. But in short, we have over 150 statutes created for our benefit. What is needed to confer federal recognition is a government-to-government relationship. And so we don't have that right now. When I was working for President Obama in 2016, we created a process at the Department of Interior, an administrative process, whereby if a Hawaiian governing entity were to meet all of the elements described in the regulation, they would be able to confer federal recognition on them. Federal recognition has not impeded our ability as a people to secure funding for education and health, as well as language preservation. In the 70s, we were on the brink of extinction of our language. And quite frankly, many of the other Pacific Islander communities, you're very fortunate because your environments were not hostile to language. So my mother lost her ability to speak because Hawaii, there was laws prohibiting it, and it was a hostile environment for her generation. And so I'm part of the lost generation. But having said that, since the 70s, there has been community organizations, a lot of federal funding for language preservation for Hawaiian language, all the way up to PhD programs in the language. So it's phenomenal, the number of speakers we have. 20 years from now, Hawaii's landscape will be completely changed. You're going to go to Ala Moana Center and you're going to hear Olelo. 50% of the Hawaiians walking around speaking Olelo. But having said that, I think for language preservation in the continent, of course, one is that federal site that I talked about, right? But I just think that in your own communities, you are able to, again, make sure they know who you are and what your needs are, and do whatever you can to preserve language and culture.
Okay, so question for Corina and Esther, and then we'll go ahead and kind of wrap it up. I know you're both busy and we appreciate you coming on. Do you think COVID-19 helps that NHPI census count, do you think it hurts it, or do you think it doesn't have an effect on it?
You go first, Corina.
Okay, feel free to chime in after. I definitely think it's hurting our community right now, just in terms of how outreach for the census usually happens, and just the breakdown in communication that all of us have been experiencing. I feel like there's a general assumption that everyone has an iPhone or some type of mobile device to connect and fill out the survey, and even connect to Wi-Fi at home, but not everyone has access to that. So that definitely cuts down on the count. Another thing is just not being able to gather. You know, we're very communal people. We like to gather around food and talk to each other in person. And so having to switch to Zoom calls is definitely taking a toll. Zoom exhaustion is a real term now. And that changes the dynamics in the room. And we're not able to really connect and get the message out there in terms of why the census is so important and why we need to make sure that each of our communities are counted. So I definitely think it's hurting us. But to look on the positive side, just with everything that's going on with COVID-19, I've been really fortunate to be a part of these different groups, you know, the National Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team, all the different regional groups that are working tirelessly, volunteering their time. So it's nice to be in a space where we can all connect again and figure out, okay, which CBO has this resource and what can I do on my end to make sure that if you are unable to support your community like that, like I can go ahead and share that with you. So just to see that we are very small in numbers sometimes, but we're able to produce the work and make sure that our name is still there and we're still counted and we're very visible amongst the continent.
Thank you, Corina. They're hard act to follow. The youngest person on the show telling us that not everybody's connected through the internet or not everybody has a smartphone.
Yeah.
I would think that maybe we would be the ones saying that, but thank you, Corina. Great point. Naki or Esther. How about Esther?
I agree. I think the census is going to be hurt because if you think about it, it's been 6 months, right?
Mm.
And even now, our Pacific Islander communities are two problems: food, and for those who are quarantined and families impact for quarantine, the state has not done a good enough job to be able to provide the facilities to be separated. So I have a Chuki's Ohana, a family unit that we're very close to, and they actually live in one of our homes on the Big Island. And the only thing that I get daily on the phone calls is who's where, because they're not in hotel rooms yet. And they're, so right now they're distracted. They cannot, I did go to Hilo to do outreach to the Pacific Islander communities, but all that was pre-pandemic. And so regrettably, right now, people's mind is only on taking care of their families and their health. And of course, there are a lot of people. One of the big challenges right now are funerals. And no matter how you tell people that they shouldn't be doing it, people from Oahu are flying to the neighbor islands and they're infecting other Pacific Islanders. And a result, because they're not used to it, the proportionate impact on those neighbor islands is greater because they don't have the resources there. So kind of bad situation right now in Hawaii. And so I leave it to those who are tasked with outreaching to our communities, but they have a tough job because I'm pretty sure when they call, most of the time they're too busy scrambling for quality of life issues and asking them, how can you help my family?
Right.
How about you, Naki? Do you think it hurts? Do you think it helps? Do you think it
Oh,
has
you
no
know, I think it hurts too, you know. One would think that we have a lot of us are home, working from home, that we would have the time, but I think the outreach, because there's so many places that, you know, we can hand out flyers. There's so many festivals, there's so many community events where we see people and we talk about how important the census is. You know, one-on-one communication to our people is important too, you know, and I understand how crazy Zoom is. And so I do believe that it has hurt us a little bit because we're so used to, everywhere we go, that we were talking census before the pandemic started. And now, community activists and leaders like yourself, Esther and Corina, talking one-on-one to people, trying to hit everyone we know, and us with the FICA broadcast every week. I think that people are getting sick of us talking about it, but it's important for us to have this conversation because
Absolutely.
we need our community to know how important it is. It's not just a number. I mean, it is a number. We have to be seen, right? We have to be seen. That's the main thing. We have to be seen, but it's also the resources that if you don't have any kids now, in 5 to 10 years, you will have kids, and they're whether your kid is 10 now or 1, in 10 years, we could be missing out on so much more. And I do believe that the pandemic is hurting our people from filling out the census because we are worrying about just trying to survive. So yeah, I believe that it is hurting our people too.
I agree too. I think it hurts. I think the pandemic hurts. Anything that affects society affects the ones that are struggling more. So if it affected society overall in terms of census registration, I think it affected people of color more because we're more likely to be worried about a place to live or food or more basic things than a lot of other, a lot of other groups. So if something's going to fall off the plate, it's going to be something that's non-essential, and we can live our lives without registering for the census. At least that's the piece that falls off the plate. So I agree with everybody on the panel. I think if it hurt all of society, it hurt us more because of the way that we have it. So I'm going to leave the closing thoughts to our panelists. Corina, anything that you haven't spoken about, or just thoughts in general about topics that we've covered today, or anything you want to say and get off your chest?
Sure. I just want to thank both of you for making this available for us and always being mindful of all the folks that are here at the table. I really appreciate it. And another thing is just in general, I think I would encourage anyone who's watching this just to be kind to anyone around you, be a little bit more patient with the folks that you are either living with or you're serving at work. And, just do your part to fill out your census and also share that with your friends and family that you know, because we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to get counted and also make it easier for folks who are doing the good work for the community.
Right.
Thank you, Corina. Esther, any closing thoughts?
Just thank you for doing this. And Naki, I know you said you guys doing this all the time, but you need to.
Yes.
Because people need to hear it. So thank you so much. Just another push for 2020 census to make sure it's done. We need to start working for the 2030 census. Corina, as you know, and for all of you actually listening, there are committees that advise the Census Bureau from our communities. And because we are broken off, we actually have the luxury. I know a lot of the people, but I'm kind of rusty. I haven't been talking to them. There is actually no reason that they could not have broken us off for the 2020 census. So that means that they weren't thinking. And the reason it's important is even if they roll up the numbers, optically, when you look at it, we're still included with all of the other categories. So there is a perception by all of the people who fill out this application that we are still Asian, right? Because they can't tell the difference. So we need to get that corrected. The only other closing thought I would have to say is do not think that the census is only about numbers. It's also about how they assess us. So 3 areas that I believe we need to make sure we use in our narratives, right? That's health data, education data, especially for higher education, and housing. So it is important, but I don't want us to put pressure on ourselves to say that we failed. We did the best that we can under these trying times. what is important is when they put out the data, we use the data and use it to our advantage in our grant writing processes. If we feel that it fails to accurately reflect us, it is our job to create that narrative for them for on the ground evidence throughout the community. It can be done. So, again, I am an internal optimist with regard to fighting for our people, just as we fight for our individual families. And of course, I have special aloha for our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, just given my eclectic background, right? While I'm both my parents are Native Hawaiian, I was born on the island of Guam until I was 9th grade, intermixed with the Chamorro and Micronesian communities, right? Go to DC, my whole congressional life, I was fighting for us on multitude of fronts, and then go to the Interior Department and help oversee the US Pacific territories. And so in my mind, we've come a long way, but again, I'm so glad to have Corina here so I can smile and realize that our future is bright. Tavai, thank you so much for organizing this. And Naki and Carl, keep up the good work. Please count on me anytime that you want. I got your back.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to give my my real quick summary, and I'm going to let Naki take us the rest of the way. I think that we need to understand how important the census is in terms of, everyday dollars and cents. Your census, depending on the state that you live in, is worth $3,000 to that state, $5,000, $4,000. That's how much checking that box and registering for the census is worth, as long as we're doing it, right? You have organizations out there that are, like we talked about, 501c3s that are fighting for you. You've got Esther and Corina out there that are fighting for food and support and programming and all these kind of things. If we don't have the numbers to tell the funders that we need to help this group of people, it's just that much harder for Esther to go to bat for us, for Corina to go to bat for us. So let's all do our part. It's not difficult to do. It's a simple process. Just commit, make a decision to do it. So thank you both, Corina and Esther, for joining us. And Naki, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. This broadcast was funded through a Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, PCORI, also Pacific Islanders Center of Primary Care Excellence. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We appreciate your time, Corina and Esther. Join us next week. We'll be having the same series, same time every Monday. Next week, we'll be seeking a cure. Please join us next week at 5 p.m. right here, 5 p.m. Koviki Talk. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And fill out your census, please. Fill out your census.
Okay, aloha, you guys.
Aloha.